Greetings, and thank you so much. Allow me to thank the Ludwig Museum and Béla Kónya for this opportunity to talk a little bit about Tomáš Valický's imaginary cameras. Just to introduce myself briefly, I am the head of the Budapest Gallery, Budapest History Museum, which is one of the 4 main divisions of the Budapest History Museum. It's the only division that focuses almost primarily on contemporary art. And it's also the only division which doesn't have its own collection. So while we have organized several exhibitions on new media art, many of which have been curated by Professor Miklós Peternák, the preservation and conservation of such works is not among our main mission. I have asked our sister institution, the Municipal Gallery of the Budapest History Museum, about the extent of new media artworks in their collection. But given the quantity and quality of these works, it would not suffice as a relevant case study here. My talk today therefore stems from my role as the curator of Valický's project and not as my role as the director of the city's contemporary art gallery. It is therefore less pragmatic and more theoretical, focusing on the question of how Valický, after decades of creating process-based net art and interactive art, arrived at a series which on several levels has a very real material presence. First, I think it should be stated that although options such as maintenance, fixing or replacing hardware or software to create a legacy environment, or reconstruction using new technology in order to emulate an original condition, present themselves to artists and curators, the likelihood of hardware and software becoming outmoded gives an artist like Valický, who has been engaged primarily with born digital artworks, a heightened sense or a heightened awareness of the obsolescence of technology. In fact, I argue that his series Imaginary Cameras, created between 2016 and 2019, can be examined and interpreted from this perspective as well. The problematic stemming from the preservation of born digital artworks is, of course, not a novel issue. In his essay, Exhibition Strategies for Digital Art, Examples and Considerations, which was published in 2019 in the volume Museums at the Post-Digital Turn, Domenico Quaranta recalls how at the turn of the millennium, when faced with conservation and marketability issues, many authors of born digital artworks turned to creating physical artifacts, material embodiments of their works, such as printouts, videos, and other documentary materials. It is hard to dispute the very material presence of imaginary cameras, high-quality prints displayed on expertly manufactured light boxes. Yet it should also be noted that these works, with a very real physical presence, were created after the new materialist paradigm, which questions previous perceptions of matter. Digital materialism of new materialist media theory strives to regard media not as products and wants to move beyond questions of representation. And I believe that these ideas are also inherent in Valický's imaginary cameras, with which we create imaginary photographs and films. But materialism appears in several other manners as well. As Sean Cubitt has said, change is the element proper to media arts especially. This rich play of presence, absence, and becoming suggests too that materiality has a part still to play in the very heart of the supposedly immaterial world of binary digits. I will attempt to illustrate that the shattering of the trope of immateriality of born digital artworks, which inferred on such works an immunity to decay, is one of the main underlining themes of Valický's imaginary cameras. Furthermore, this increased awareness of the physical limitations and difficulties of preserving new media by museologists and restorers led artists such as Valický to emphasize a connection between old and new media. Allow me to give you a brief summary of the series Imaginary Cameras. The mapping of human vision has been a recurring theme in the work of Tomáš Valický. The spatial representation of time, futuristic renderings of augmented reality, and the examination of optical distortions have all played central roles in his works. In this series, he examined how our vision, which evolves continuously over the course of our lives and which are deeply rooted in our culture, also defines what we regard as a faithful rendering of the world. And conversely, these images affect and seem to confirm our cultural ways of seeing. Over the past 2 centuries, the invention of various picture recording devices has shaped our ways of seeing and thereby manipulating our images or our image of the world in much the same way as computers manipulate our image or our seeing. Walitsky's series, Imaginary Cameras, reverses this relationship, demonstrating how when an inventor creates a new device, his or her worldview often predetermines the mechanism of the apparatus and the character of the images the device can create. Walitsky's 24 precisely constructed machines, which are cameras, projectors, and viewers, reveal with their analog mechanisms alternative renderings of reality, while at the same time dissolving the opposition between seeing and knowing, computer vision and human vision. The designs and mechanics of the devices make specific references to cameras of earlier periods. The limitations in these mechanisms, including elements of unpredictability in contrast to the over-controlled, overdeveloped instant imaging systems of today, have a liberating effect on the artist. With his fictional cameras, Walitsky does not seek to create a seemingly plausible virtual reality, but rather calls attention to the existence of different ways of seeing. The designs of the cameras, which operate on analog principles and which were made with digital software, are displayed in 24 light boxes. In addition to these static renderings, animations and an interactive digital installation present the ways in which these devices, which could in fact be constructed, would operate. As for the kinds of pictures these fantasy cameras would produce, the artist entrusts this to the beholder's imagination. The interactive installation in the exhibition is a paraphrase of one of the cameras on a light box, but while the latter shows an analog camera, the former works, of course, with digital software, computer, digital cameras, a TV screen, and a touch screen. Items of equipment, some of which were tailor-made, are conceptually important to the work and are markedly visible. When installing this during the particularly wet and stormy weeks leading up to the Venice Biennale, we were faced with the technical limitations of waterproof panorama cameras and long USB cords. The limitations of these technical parts drew our attention to the material specificity of the digital interactive installation in a very practical sense. When looking at the computer graphics on the light boxes, their aesthetic, the numerous varieties of metal surfaces, the meticulously thought-through use of light, reminds us of product photography, and perhaps unavoidably, we imagine that the depicted devices exist, and we are, in fact, looking at a large-scale catalog of cameras. However, there are, I believe, numerous other ways in which imaginary cameras are a comment on materialism. Of these, I will focus on 2. First, the subject matter of the representations are not just simply objects, but are devices with which other objects, other artifacts, specifically images with a material quality, can be made, albeit only in our imagination. As Peter Osborne put it, data is the origin of digital imaging, while object is the origin of analog imaging. When one speaks of a picture, however, it is hard to conceive of one without some kind of physical carrier. The objects depicted in these light boxes are tools which call out to us to be used by us in our imagination. And in their imaginary use, they produce images that exist in our minds, but which are also nevertheless tied to physical processes, light hitting a film or a glass plate, and have a physical carrier, so a glass plate or film. Because the trope of immateriality of digital imaging still exists, Walitsky shows us these processes of creating pictures through analog devices, because it still makes more sense to us to see chemical reactions to light. Second, according to his own testament, Walitsky is interested in how, with analog mechanisms, mistakes, seemingly imperfect visual recordings can occur. mistakes in the digital world are customarily referred to as glitches, and they are seemingly much easier to correct than mistakes in their analog counterparts. Computer softwares, for example, often have the capability of self-correcting, and this capability of self-fixing defects caused by the materiality of the media, like an electric cord, for example, is something that new media artists reckon with. Once a digitally conceived work gains a physical form, however, small mistakes, imperfections, or merely differences can occur, and such as the appearance of, like, for example, in a black and white print, you can have a little bit of blue tone. Such mistakes, imperfections, or differences draw attention to the material aspect of a digitally born artwork. The preliminary process for recent work by Zsuzsanna SZEGEDY-MASZÁK, who was one of the co-authors of Wolitzki's interactive installation at the present exhibition, provides an interesting illustration of what happens during the process of casting, metaphorically and literally, of a digital image into a material artifact. 3D digital prints created from the same algorithm shows differences visible to the naked eye. These differences are caused by external factors, movement of the machine, differences in the temperature in the room, or some inconsistency in the printing material. So all of these are printouts of the same algorithm. And yet you can visibly see prominent differences. And so these are prints exercises for eventually this work, which is called Hardly Readable Works. It seems that once physical matter is involved, there's no such thing as a true copy. When referring to John Cage's claim that Pike's Zenfo film was much improved when it was damaged, Sean Cubitt claims that this moment in Fluxus showed that electronic glitch matters because it is matter. In the beginning of my talk, I suggested that ideas of new materialist media theory are also inherent in Wolitzki's latest works. And in my assessment, the fact that the works require our intellectual interaction to create imaginary images that upon receiving a material form might show small imperfections that matter because they are matter, is one of the ways in which this manifests itself. But there is perhaps yet another way digital materialism gains expression in imaginary cameras, and that is when we consider the mechanisms of the devices. The artist assistant, Anna Szepesi, referred to these cameras as metaphors for various ways of seeing. Building on this line of thought, I believe that they can also be understood as material embodiments of various computer softwares which enable us to visualize a spectacle in a certain manner. Take, for instance, the orthographic camera, with its multitude of lenses, each allowing a recording of all parts of a scene within the framework from exactly 90 degrees without any optical distortion. This camera essentially provides us with a visual form that an axonometric 3D design program can do. If we accept this premise, then Wolitzki's imaginary cameras comment on the materiality of software, a notion which has been touched on by many theorists as a reaction to Friedrich Kittler's essay, There is No Software. As a final thought on how Tomasz Wolitzki's imaginary cameras comment on a discourse among museum professionals in questions of new media art preservation, I would like to show you a picture of the glass plate viewer, for which Wolitzki created a new animation since the opening of the Venice Biennale, and is therefore presented to the public for the first time here at the Ludwig Museum. The work has a personal reference, as many of the other works that you can see on the second floor. In this case, it is the artist refers to himself as a creative young child who made hand-drawn drawings with an 8mm camera. In the glass plate viewer, we see the story of Biggie Buggy's space travel. An animation which fortunately survived on celluloid film and which Wolitzki, similarly to museum professionals, digitalized when creating his computer graphic half a century later. What we perhaps don't immediately reckon with is the scrupulous process of recalibration of the colors that Wolitzki had to perform in order to compensate for the different, albeit imaginary, presentation of the animation. While in 1968, it was a film on celluloid, in 2018, it was transferred to a glass plate, a device that incidentally presents to be from an earlier period of technological innovation. In the case of the light box, the backlighting is a physical version of the illumination the glass plate receives in the digital image. The newest animation in imaginary cameras, which shows the glass plate viewer in the round, gives us an opportunity to look at the device from all angles of the world, of analog and digital, seeing and knowing, virtual and physical, and imaginary and material coalesce into one realm. Thank you.